September 19th, 1944. Dawn broke grey and heavy over the French countryside near the small village of Aracourt. A fog clung to the fields, thick enough to swallow entire formations, muffling sound and blinding vision. Out of the haze, the silhouettes of German panthers emerged, hulking steel beasts, their long 75mm guns pointed forward, their tracks chewing into the damp soil. To the Germans inside, this was familiar ground. They had fought in Russia's endless steppes, in Poland's fields, in France before. They were veterans, hardened men inside armored fortresses. Their orders were clear: cut through the American lines, drive them back, and remind these so-called citizen soldiers what it meant to face a panzer division. But what they could not see, hidden in the fog, were American Shermans lying in wait. Not in clumsy formation, not tied to rigid commands, but scattered like hunters, moving and communicating in real time. Radios crackled inside every tank. Coordinates whispered, fire orders exchanged. To the Germans, this level of coordination seemed impossible. The Americans were supposed to be amateurs, farmers in uniforms, factory workers holding rifles, students pressed into service. Yet on that morning at Aracourt, the battlefield told a different story. At precisely 0730, the silence shattered. A thunderous roar of engines, and the snap of tank guns broke through the mist. German panthers advanced in disciplined lines, their commanders shouting over intercoms, but the Americans struck like phantoms. One moment nothing, the next moment, a Sherman appeared from behind a hedgerow, fired and vanished into the fog. Another Sherman, 2 fields over, relayed the Panthers' position over radio. Within seconds, fire came from multiple angles, invisible and relentless. German crews fired back, but their shots fell against shifting targets. Confusion seeped in. Who was in command? Where were the enemy positions? Why did the Americans move with such uncanny precision? To the German officers observing, it made no sense. For years they had mocked the American army as untrained, undisciplined, soft. Hitler himself sneered at the idea of a democracy raising soldiers worth fearing. Wehrmacht propaganda called them the businessmen's army, soldiers who lacked the warrior spirit of Europe's professional forces. Yet here, in the mud and fog of Lorraine, the truth was undeniable. These citizen soldiers fought with a strange, terrifying unity. Smoke billowed as panthers erupted into flames, their armor pierced at close range. German radio nets, already stretched thin, filled with static and broken orders. Platoon leaders lost contact with companies, companies lost contact with battalions, but the Americans, every tank, every platoon, remained bound together through invisible threads of communication. It was as if they shared one mind, moving with a speed and cohesion that defied German expectations. Inside one Panther, a gunner named Hans Meyer stared through his scope at an American Sherman barely visible in the fog. He adjusted, fired, and the shot slammed into the ground, missing by meters. Before he could reload, the Sherman had disappeared again. Seconds later, fire came from his flank. The tank shook violently as armor shattered. Flames roared into the cabin. His commander screamed. The crew scrambled to escape. In that instant, Meyer realized something chilling. This was not the clumsy second-rate enemy he had been promised. This was an army that had learned, adapted, and now hunted. The Germans had entered Aracourt expecting to cut through weak opposition. Instead, they faced a nightmare of mobility and coordination. Reports from the front lines grew frantic. The enemy is everywhere, they vanish and strike again. We cannot hold positions. To the men of the 11th Panzer Division, it felt like fighting ghosts armed with steel. By midday, the battlefield was littered with the burning hulks of Panthers and Shermans alike. Yet the balance was clear. The Germans, though experienced, were disoriented and fragmented. The Americans, though mocked as amateurs, were turning the tide. Their supposed weakness, the fact that they were ordinary men drawn from farms, factories, and cities, had become their strength. They fought with flexibility, with innovation, with a reliance on technology and teamwork that the German army could not comprehend. As the fog lifted in the afternoon sun, the full scale of destruction emerged. Dozens of German tanks lay smouldering, fields churned into craters. The air reeked of cordite and burning fuel, and through it all, American tankers, these citizen soldiers, pressed forward. Their radios crackled with calm efficiency. Their commanders adjusted in real time, and step by step, they forced the veterans of the Panzerwaffe into retreat. That morning at Aracourt was not just a clash of steel and fire, it was a clash of ideologies. On one side, a totalitarian state that believed only in professional warriors, forged through years of indoctrination and conquest. On the other, a democracy that had called upon its everyday citizens to fight, not as individuals but as a collective, bound by communication and purpose. The result was a battlefield transformation the Germans had not anticipated, and one they would never forget. For the men on the ground, the reality was brutal. German crews, trapped in their tanks, faced death in fire and smoke. American crews, inside their Shermans, endured the constant terror of knowing a single Panther shell could cut them apart. Yet courage burned equally. Tankers fought, bled and died in the mud. Still, the outcome was undeniable. The German myth of superiority cracked that day, struck down not by aristocratic officers or professional warriors, but by ordinary men with extraordinary resolve. As dusk settled, the fields of Lorraine glowed with the eerie orange of burning machines. German survivors limped back, their confidence shattered. American units, weary but unbroken, held their ground. And in the silence that followed, a lesson etched itself into history, that in modern war arrogance is fatal, and underestimating an enemy, especially one made of citizens bound together by will and technology, can lead to ruin. For the first time, the German army understood the bitter truth. The men they had laughed at, the soldiers they had dismissed as weak, had fought like professionals, like veterans, like warriors born in fire. And from that day forward, the legend of the citizen soldier would no longer be a joke, it would be a nightmare stalking the battlefield. The fog of Aracourt lifted to reveal not just a tactical victory, but the beginning of a new kind of warfare, one where ordinary men, guided by invisible signals, could outmaneuver and outfight the veterans of Europe. The Germans had mocked them, now they feared them. By the spring of 1943, the world had already seen 4 years of ceaseless war. Europe, smouldered under the boots of the Wehrmacht. North Africa had become a graveyard of ambitions, and the Eastern Front devoured men and machines in a furnace of unimaginable scale. The German war machine, forged in blitzkrieg and sharpened by years of ruthless campaigning, stood at its peak in confidence and lethality. To the men in grey uniforms, their dominance seemed unquestionable. They had crushed France in 6 weeks, rolled through Poland like thunder, and pushed deep into the Soviet Union. To them, war was the domain of professionals, career soldiers shaped by Prussian tradition, drilled with discipline, hardened by endless campaigns. And then came the Americans. When the United States entered the war after Pearl Harbor, German officers sneered at the thought of American troops. What could they be but amateurs? Farmers in helmets, shop clerks with rifles, students stumbling through drills. They were called cowboys, butchers and bakers in uniform, and citizen soldiers in the most mocking sense. The Germans believed war was an art too complex, too brutal, for democracies and civilians to master. Their propaganda painted the US Army as soft, dependent on machines, incapable of withstanding the shock of real combat. Hitler himself ridiculed them, dismissing the American fighting man as an imitation soldier who would crumble under fire. But the reality was far different. By 1942, American industry had ignited into a juggernaut of production. Detroit's auto factories turned from cars to tanks. Boeing and Lockheed filled the skies with bombers and fighters. Shipyards on the coasts worked around the clock, launching Liberty ships faster than U-boats could sink them. The arsenal of democracy had awakened, and it was not just sending machines, it was sending men, millions of them. From small towns in Iowa, from the streets of Chicago, from the farms of Texas and the harbors of New York, ordinary citizens answered the call. They left behind plows, tools, and books to don uniforms, transforming overnight into the force that would challenge the myth of German invincibility. Still, their inexperience showed in the early days. The baptism of fire in North Africa was brutal. At Kasserine Pass in February 1943, Rommel's veterans tore through green American divisions, scattering units and exposing glaring flaws in leadership, coordination, and training. To the Germans, Kasserine confirmed their prejudices. Americans were soft, their officers untested, their soldiers prone to panic. German field reports mocked their opponents as brave but clumsy, soldiers who needed more time in barracks than on the battlefield. The reputation of the citizen soldier seemed for a moment to be exactly what the Germans had believed. Yet the defeat at Kasserine became a crucible. American commanders studied their failures with relentless urgency. General Eisenhower reorganized the command structure. Leaders like George Patton instilled discipline, speed, and aggression. Training intensified, logistics improved. Communications were overhauled. In months, the U.S. Army transformed itself, turning weakness into resilience, mistakes into hard-earned lessons. Unlike the rigid German system, where doctrine was carved into stone, the Americans adapted. They learned fast, and they applied those lessons with a creativity that stunned their enemies. By the time the Allies invaded Sicily in July 1943, a different American army landed on the beaches, better equipped, better led, and supported by the might of Allied naval and air power. These amateurs pushed north with growing confidence. German commanders noted with unease how quickly the Americans had matured. Their artillery was devastating, their air support constant, their logistics seemingly endless. For every tank or gun lost, replacements poured in. For every mistake, new tactics emerged. Where the Germans relied on experience, the Americans relied on innovation and sheer scale. By 1944, as the Allies stormed Normandy and pushed into France, the balance of the war had shifted. The German army, once invincible, now faced an opponent unlike any it had ever encountered. Not aristocrats trained in military academies, not peasants drilled from youth in the rigid culture of obedience, but everyday men, citizens who carried into battle not only rifles, but the ingenuity, adaptability, and unbreakable morale of a nation fighting for survival and principle. The irony was bitter for the Germans. Their officers had long mocked democracy as weak, fractured, incapable of producing warriors. Yet in the fields of France they faced divisions filled with men who had been mechanics, farmers, and students mere months before, now wielding the tools of modern war with deadly skill. They did not fight as isolated soldiers but as interconnected units, tied together by radios, by logistics chains stretching across oceans, by an industrial backbone that no other nation could match. For the Germans, who prided themselves on their professional soldier caste, this was disorienting. They fought men who had never intended to be soldiers, men who might have spent their lives building houses, teaching children, or driving trucks, yet who now stood toe-to-toe with veterans of the Eastern Front and would not yield. These citizen soldiers lacked the polish of parade grounds, but on the battlefield they proved themselves adaptable, relentless, and most fatally for the Germans, unending. For every American killed or wounded, another stepped forward. For every Sherman tank destroyed, Detroit built 2 more. The Germans could not comprehend such depth, such resilience. By the time of the battles in Lorraine, the Germans had begun to understand. Their mockery of the Americans had transformed into frustration, then fear. Reports from panzer commanders described American forces as everywhere and nowhere, their mobility and coordination confounding veteran units. The arrogance that had once fueled German confidence began to erode under the weight of a harsh reality. The citizen soldiers of the United States were not only competent, they were winning. This was the true context of the battles that unfolded in 1944. The German army stood bloodied but still formidable, commanded by experienced leaders, fielding tanks that outclassed American Shermans in firepower and armor. Yet the Americans brought something intangible to the battlefield, an ability to adapt, to innovate, and to connect. It was not just their machines, though those were formidable. It was their spirit, their teamwork, and the collective strength of a nation that refused to bow. In the eyes of German veterans, it was almost unthinkable. A society that had scorned militarism, a democracy that had been mocked as weak, had forged an army that could meet them in open battle and prevail. The myth of German superiority cracked not with a single blow, but with the grinding, relentless advance of men who had once been ordinary citizens, now bound by duty, courage, and the invisible threads of a new kind of warfare. As 1944 drew on, it became clear that the war was no longer just about professional soldiers versus amateurs. It was about adaptability versus rigidity, mass production versus scarcity, innovation versus tradition. And in that clash, the citizen soldiers of America, once mocked, ridiculed, underestimated, proved themselves not only equal to the task, but capable of crushing the very legends who had once looked down on them. September 1944. Lorraine. The battle-scarred countryside trembled beneath the rumble of German armor. The 11th Panzer Division advanced with confidence, believing themselves to be the masters of mechanized warfare. They had endured years on the Eastern Front, facing Soviet T-34s and endless swarms of infantry. Against them now stood Americans, fresh-faced, untested, the so-called citizen soldiers. To the German mind, the outcome was predetermined. Superior training, superior tanks, superior tactics. They believed victory was inevitable. But there was something the Germans did not yet understand. Something invisible, intangible, but decisive. It was not a new weapon in the conventional sense, not thicker armor, not a bigger gun, not even a faster tank. It was a hidden advantage that shifted the very balance of the battlefield, the radio. Inside every American tank, from Sherman to Hellcat, the crackle of communication filled the steel walls. The SCR 508 radio, heavy and boxy, linked tank commanders not just to their platoon, not just to their company, but to artillery batteries, infantry units, and higher command. Orders traveled in seconds. A target spotted by one crew became a target engaged by dozens. A flank exposed in one corner of the battlefield became an opportunity for the entire formation. It was as though the American armored forces shared a single nervous system, reacting instantly to threats, striking with uncanny coordination. By contrast, the German tanks, magnificent as they were in engineering, suffered a fatal flaw. Most German panzer crews did not carry full radio sets. In a platoon, often only the commander's tank had both transmitters and receivers. The rest could listen, but not speak. Orders had to flow down like water from the top, delayed and inflexible. If a commander was knocked out, the unit often dissolved into confusion. German efficiency, so famed, so feared, was in reality strangled by silence. It was this difference that turned the battlefield at places like Arcourt into a nightmare for the Wehrmacht. Imagine a Panther, its thick armor shrugging off shells, its gun tearing through Shermans with precision. But in the chaos of combat it became isolated. The commander shouted over the intercom, desperate for support, but no reinforcements came. No radio could call them in. Meanwhile, the Americans swarmed with fluid movements. A Sherman relayed the Panther's position. Another unit flanked. Artillery was summoned with a quick burst of static. The Panther, though powerful, became prey, not because it was weaker, but because it was alone. German officers noticed this with growing dread. Reports filtered back describing Americans who seemed to act with unnatural coordination, appearing and disappearing with ghostly speed. It was not magic. It was technology combined with doctrine. The Americans embraced decentralized command. Junior officers, even sergeants, had the authority to make decisions. Radios gave them the tools to do so instantly. A lieutenant did not need to wait for a colonel's word. A tank commander did not need to see his superior face to face. Information flowed freely, and with it came adaptability. To the Germans, locked into rigid hierarchies, this was baffling. They had been trained to expect initiative only from the highest levels. When those links broke, units faltered. For Americans, the opposite was true. When higher command was cut off, lower levels stepped in. Radios empowered them, weaving the battlefield into a living, breathing network. The secret advantage did not end with armor. Infantry carried portable radios, linking squads to supporting artillery. Forward observers directed fire with deadly precision. Aircraft coordinated with ground forces through radio nets, ensuring close air support arrived where it was needed most. To German soldiers, the battlefield became a place of disjointed chaos. They advanced against what they thought were isolated positions, only to find themselves encircled, bombarded, and counterattacked. The Americans were not better individually, but they were united, their strength multiplied by invisible threads of communication. This unseen edge carried a psychological weight as well. German crews who survived encounters with American forces often wrote in disbelief. They described opponents who were not only resilient but omnipresent. One after-action report spoke of enemy tanks that strike from every direction, as if guided by one mind. Another German officer remarked bitterly that while his men were superior fighters, the Americans fought as one machine impossible to dislocate. The irony was cruel. Germany had pioneered the concept of blitzkrieg, the lightning war built on speed, surprise, and coordination. But by 1944, it was the Americans who had mastered the tools to make such doctrine unstoppable. Where the Germans relied on couriers, runners, and limited signals, the Americans relied on the crackle of radios that never ceased. The battlefield no longer belonged to the side with the heaviest tank or the bravest infantry. It belonged to the side that could connect. This hidden advantage had its roots not in the trenches, but in factories and laboratories across the Atlantic. While German engineers perfected armor plating and optics, American companies like Motorola perfected frequency modulation technology, producing radios that resisted static and interference. These were not glamorous weapons. They did not roar like cannons or gleam like panzer steel. They sat in boxes humming with electricity, yet they turned scattered groups of citizen soldiers into cohesive armies. And so the myth of the amateur began to crumble. At Lorraine, at the Ardennes, in hedgerows and open plains, the Germans encountered something they had not expected: ordinary men who fought with the coordination of professionals. The secret was not bloodline or upbringing. It was not centuries of military tradition. It was technology married to the democratic spirit of adaptability. Radios gave citizens the power to act like veterans, and that broke the back of German confidence. The hidden advantage was not just about machines. It was about mindset. Germans mocked the Americans for being citizen soldiers. What they failed to realize was that in a democracy, citizens think, adapt, and innovate. Radios gave them the means to do so collectively, faster than any rigid army could match. In war, that difference became lethal. By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht began to grasp the terrible truth. They were not losing because their soldiers lacked courage or skill. They were losing because their opponents had found a way to fight as one organism, where every tank, every rifle, every battery could communicate and respond in unison. The Germans had mocked the Americans as amateurs. But when the smoke cleared, it was those very amateurs who held the advantage that would decide the fate of battles and ultimately the war itself. The SCR 508 weighed nearly 200 pounds, a steel box packed with vacuum tubes, coils, and crystal controls. It did not look like a weapon. There were no sharp edges, no gleaming barrels. To the untrained eye, it seemed little more than a hunk of metal and wires, humming quietly in the corner of a Sherman tank. But this unassuming device was one of the most decisive instruments of the Second World War. With its arrival, the United States Army carried into battle a weapon that the Germans did not fully possess: the ability to speak across the chaos of combat, instantly and clearly. To understand the impact, one must look at the specifications. The SCR 508 was a frequency-modulated radio set, operating in the 20.0–27.9 MHz band. Unlike the German Fugue 5 radios, which used amplitude modulation and were vulnerable to static and interference, the American system cut through the noise of engines, artillery, and atmospheric disturbances. In practice, this meant that while German tank commanders strained to make sense of garbled signals, American crews exchanged crisp, unbroken communication. A tank platoon could coordinate maneuvers in seconds. An artillery observer could summon a barrage within moments. This was not just convenience, it was lethality. The power output of the SCR 508 reached 25 watts, twice the effective punch of the German Fugue 5. With a range of 5 miles under combat conditions, it gave American units a connective tissue the Wehrmacht lacked. The receiver-transmitter unit contained over 2,700 components, assembled in Detroit factories by men and women working 12-hour shifts. Each set cost around $2,000 at the time, but American industry produced them in the tens of thousands, embedding them into every armored vehicle. A Sherman tank without an SCR 508 was incomplete. Communication was no longer an accessory, it was standard. In contrast, German doctrine remained rooted in scarcity. Many German tanks carried only receivers. They could hear orders but not respond. Communication flowed in one direction from commander to subordinate. When chaos fractured those lines, silence followed. German platoons could stall if the lead tank was destroyed, leaving powerful Panthers or Tigers blind to changing circumstances. American tanks, by contrast, did not stop moving when a commander fell. Any tank could assume control. Any platoon could reorganize. The network held firm. The roots of this innovation lay in American industry and engineering. Companies like Galvin Manufacturing Corporation, later known as Motorola, took the theories of Edwin Howard Armstrong, the father of FM radio, and turned them into battlefield reality. Engineers designed ruggedized sets that could withstand vibration, dust, and shock. They were tested not in laboratories alone, but in desert trials, under mud, in the biting cold of training grounds. Every challenge refined them until they were ready for the crucible of combat. The Germans, for all their mechanical brilliance, lagged behind in this field. Their Fugue 5 radios were adequate for the Blitzkrieg campaigns of 1939 and 1940, where speed and shock overwhelmed unprepared enemies. But by 1944, in the grinding battles of attrition, their limitations were glaring. Static-filled channels broke under artillery bombardments. Communication bottlenecks left units paralyzed. German engineers experimented with FM technology, but their industry, crippled by Allied bombing, raw material shortages, and competing priorities, could not match American output. Where the United States mass-produced innovation, Germany rationed compromise. The numbers told the story. By late 1944, over 50,000 SCR 508 sets were in service, and production lines showed no sign of slowing. They were installed not only in tanks but in half-tracks, command vehicles, and artillery coordination units. The U.S. Army built a battlefield web that spanned from the smallest platoon to the highest command echelon. Information flowed upward and downward, side to side, binding infantry, armor, and aircraft together. The result was synergy, the kind of integration the Germans had once pioneered in Blitzkrieg, but could no longer replicate. Consider the difference in a tank engagement. A German Panther spots an American Sherman. The German commander relays its position by intercom, but calling for help requires a chain of signals up to company down to platoon, often delayed by interference. In that time, the Sherman crew radios their position to nearby tanks, requests artillery fire, and coordinates a flanking maneuver. Within minutes, the Panther faces not one opponent but three, with shells falling around it from unseen artillery. On paper, the Panther is superior, thicker armor, more powerful gun, longer range, but in reality, it becomes outnumbered and outmaneuvered. The radio turns quantity into quality. This was not only about tanks. American infantry units carried the SCR 300 walkie-talkie, a man-portable FM set with a range of 3 to 5 miles. Weighing 35 pounds, it strapped onto the backs of radio operators, who became the nerve centers of platoons. With these, infantry could direct supporting fire, call in armor, or adjust artillery without delay. German infantry, by comparison, relied heavily on field telephones or runners, both easily disrupted. A cut wire or a fallen messenger meant silence. For the Americans, even under fire, the radios kept talking. The brilliance lay in how technology met doctrine. The U.S. Army encouraged initiative at the lower levels. Junior officers and even sergeants were empowered to act on real-time information. Radios amplified this philosophy, turning battlefield autonomy into battlefield dominance. German doctrine, built on centralized control, could not adapt with the same speed. When orders failed, German units stalled. When American orders failed, radios and initiative filled the gap. The factories that built these radios became as important as the steel mills forging Sherman armor. In Chicago, Detroit, and New York, assembly lines produced communication sets at a pace rivaling tank production. Women in overalls soldered circuits, wound coils, and tested transmitters with the same urgency as men riveting armor plates. Their labor turned into invisible weapons, unseen by the enemy until the moment of battle, when American units moved with a coherence that seemed impossible. For German intelligence officers, the revelation was devastating. Captured equipment revealed the scale of American radio deployment, and reports from the front described opponents who could summon reserves with uncanny speed. One officer wrote bitterly, We fight a hydra, cut one head, and another appears, as if by magic. The magic, of course, was electromagnetic. This deep dive into technology explains why the myth of the citizen soldier collapsed under the weight of reality. The Germans had mocked Americans for lacking tradition, but tradition could not overcome innovation. Radios turned farmers into field commanders, clerks into coordinated fighters, mechanics into tactical assets. When combined with America's industrial scale, the result was overwhelming. The SCR 508 and its cousins did not make headlines in the same way as Sherman tanks or P-51 Mustangs. Yet they defined the shape of modern warfare. For the first time, war became truly networked. Every gun, every tank, every squad was a node in a web of communication, and in that web, the citizen soldier found his strength, not in isolation, but in connection. September 18, 1944. Lorraine, France. Dawn crept over the rolling hills, casting a pale light across fields still soaked from autumn rains. For the men of the German 11th Panzer Division, this was familiar territory, fog-choked landscapes, the clatter of treads, the anticipation of armored assault. Their mission was simple: break the American lines, exploit the weak citizen soldiers, and reassert German dominance in the West. With them advanced nearly 75 Panthers, the most feared tanks in Europe, their armor thick, their 75 guns deadly at over a mile. To their commanders, the outcome seemed inevitable. The Americans, however, were waiting. Units of the U.S. 4th Armored Division had entrenched themselves in the lowlands near Aracourt. Their Shermans were inferior in almost every way on paper: thinner armor, smaller guns, slower to fire. Yet they possessed two things the Germans could not see: radios in every vehicle and a doctrine built on flexibility. At 0700, the fog thickened, reducing visibility to less than 200 yards. Out of the haze, the first Panthers emerged, black crosses painted on steel, engines growling like beasts. The German formation advanced in disciplined lines, their commanders confident. Then came the crackle of American radios. Orders relayed instantly, coordinates shared. A Sherman platoon maneuvered out of concealment. Emerging from a tree line like hunters springing a trap, they fired. One Panther erupted in flames, black smoke billowing into the mist. The Shermans vanished just as quickly, slipping back behind cover. The Germans pressed on, but the Americans struck again from another direction. What followed was a duel of machines and men that lasted hours. German crews strained to see through fogged periscopes. A Panther would fire, and moments later, incoming rounds would crash into its flank. The Shermans could not win toe-to-toe. Every man knew that. But with radios they became ghosts, coordinating ambushes, striking and vanishing before the enemy could react. Every Panther destroyed was not the result of luck, but of orchestration. By midday, the battlefield near Aracourt had turned into a graveyard. German tanks, designed to dominate with their superior firepower, became isolated targets. A Panther commander, unable to contact his supporting units, found himself surrounded by 3 Shermans coordinating by radio. His tank burned within minutes. Elsewhere, German infantry tried to advance alongside the armor but were cut down by artillery that responded instantly to forward observers' calls. The numbers were staggering. Between September 18th and 29th, in a series of engagements near Aracourt, the U.S. 4th Armored Division destroyed or disabled 86 German tanks, while losing only 25 of their own. Kill ratios favored the Americans nearly 4-1. Reports from the front painted a shocking picture for German high command. Panthers and Panzer IVs, machines that had dominated the Eastern Front, were being outmaneuvered and picked apart by Shermans, the very tanks they had mocked as underpowered. German survivors could hardly believe it. One after-action report lamented, "Our tanks are superior, yet they are hunted like prey. The Americans strike from many directions at once, vanishing before we can return fire." Another commander admitted bitterly, "The enemy reacts as if of one mind while we are blind." The difference was not courage. German tank crews fought with determination, often standing their ground even as their vehicles were set ablaze. Nor was it individual skill. Many had years of combat experience against the Red Army. The difference was the unseen network of communication that bound the Americans together. A single Sherman might be outgunned, but 5 Shermans coordinating by radio became a pack of predators capable of bringing down even the most formidable panther. The fog of Aracourt amplified this advantage. Visibility collapsed, and with it, the Germans' reliance on superior optics and long-range gunnery. In the haze, battles unfolded at point-blank ranges. Radio-linked Shermans could maneuver in near silence, striking in pairs and platoons. The Panthers, isolated and unable to coordinate effectively, blundered forward, only to be flanked. The battlefield was not just a clash of machines, it was a test of systems, and the American system proved stronger. Even the German infantry felt the weight of this disadvantage. Attempting to reinforce their tanks, they found themselves pinned by artillery fire summoned in minutes. American forward observers, crouched in hedgerows with SCR-300 radios, directed fire with deadly precision. A company that had once taken hours to bring artillery to bear could now shift barrages in moments. For the Germans, the ground shook with explosions that seemed to follow them wherever they moved. On September 19th, the Germans attempted a massive armored thrust, hoping to overwhelm the Americans through sheer numbers. 50 Panthers rolled forward, engines growling, guns thundering. Yet once again, the Americans responded with uncanny speed. Shermans hit from the flanks. Tank destroyers joined the fray, their high-velocity guns finding targets in the mist. By day's end, nearly half the German force lay wrecked in the fields. The humiliation was complete. German officers who had ridiculed the Americans now faced an undeniable truth. The citizen soldiers had fought not as amateurs but as professionals. Worse still, they had fought as an interconnected organism, faster, more adaptive, more resilient. The myth of German superiority, so carefully cultivated, began to unravel in the mud and smoke of Lorraine. And for the Americans, the victory was more than tactical. It was proof that their system worked. Proof that ordinary men, clerks, farmers, mechanics, could stand against Europe's finest and prevail. Aracourt became a symbol, a battle where radios and initiative transformed underdogs into victors. The battlefield was quiet by September 30th. The fog had lifted, the wreckage lay smoking, and the survivors buried their dead. German soldiers trudged back in defeat, their confidence shattered. American units held the ground, battered but unbroken, their Shermans scarred yet still mobile. The citizen soldiers had done more than hold the line. They had crushed one of Germany's elite panzer formations. The lesson of Aracourt echoed far beyond the Lorraine countryside. It was a demonstration of how technology, doctrine, and will could overturn assumptions of superiority. The Germans had entered the fight believing themselves unbeatable. They left humbled, their most powerful weapons undone by men they had dismissed as amateurs. In the end, the fields of Lorraine were not merely littered with steel carcasses. They were littered with the remnants of an idea that professional soldiers alone decide the outcome of war. At Aracourt, the citizen soldier proved otherwise, and the German army would never forget it. The men of the Wehrmacht had long believed themselves heirs to centuries of military tradition, soldiers molded by discipline and sharpened by fire. Their confidence was not unfounded. German arms had swept across Europe in the early years of the war, humbling armies from Warsaw to Paris. Yet by the autumn of 1944, something had shifted. In the mud of Lorraine, the old certainties crumbled. The panzer divisions, once symbols of unstoppable might, staggered back from Aracourt humbled, their superiority shattered not by better armor or bigger guns, but by something less tangible, something that gnawed at the very psychology of war: connection. For the Germans, command and control was hierarchical. Orders flowed down, rarely up. Platoons and companies depended heavily on the survival of their commanders. If a leader's tank burned on the battlefield, units often stalled, paralyzed without direction. Radios, when present, were scarce and one-sided. Fear crept in quickly under these conditions. Crews cut off from command, hearing only the hiss of static where instructions should have been. Isolation bred hesitation, and hesitation meant death. The Americans, however, fought differently. Their citizen soldiers carried no illusions of aristocratic military heritage. They were farmers, truck drivers, mechanics, men accustomed to solving problems in daily life without waiting for permission. On the battlefield, this instinct for improvisation became deadly. Armed with radios, they operated as a collective, each tank, each squad, a node in a vast web of communication. If a commander fell, another voice filled the channel. If a flank faltered, reinforcements were redirected within minutes. For the Germans, accustomed to shattering their enemies by decapitating command structures, this resilience was disorienting. The Americans refused to break. The psychological toll was immense. German tank crews who had once taken pride in their ability to dominate lesser foes, now felt hunted. They described the Americans as everywhere at once, appearing on their flanks, striking from hidden positions, vanishing into fog. It was not that the Americans were invisible, it was that they moved in coordination so fluid that the Germans could not track or predict them. Each engagement felt like being surrounded by phantoms. Panic began to erode confidence. Crews reported firing blindly into the mist, convinced that Shermans lurked in every hedgerow. The battlefield became a place of constant dread, not certainty. For American soldiers, the radios did more than connect them tactically. They connected them emotionally. A tank crew, isolated inside the steel belly of a Sherman, knew they were not alone. Voices crackled in their ears, familiar, reassuring, alive. They could call for help and hear it coming. They could check in with comrades, receive updates, feel part of something larger. In the chaos of combat, this bond was invaluable. Fear still lived in their hearts. Every man knew the odds of surviving a direct hit from a Panther were slim, but they did not feel abandoned. The network of voices became a lifeline, turning terror into determination. This difference shaped entire campaigns. At Aracourt, the Americans demonstrated that even inferior tanks, when bound together by communication, could defeat Germany's best. In the Ardennes, during the Battle of the Bulge, the same principle held true. German armored thrusts, powerful on paper, fractured when supply lines faltered and communication broke down. American units, though battered, held together through their radios, coordinating stubborn defenses that stalled the offensive. Once again, the citizen soldiers proved unshakable, not because of raw firepower, but because of cohesion. Strategically, the impact rippled far beyond individual battles. The Germans began to realize they could no longer rely on the psychological shock of overwhelming armor. Fear, once their weapon, now turned against them. Reports of Panther crews abandoning tanks when isolated, of infantry refusing to advance without armor, of entire battalions hesitating under pressure, all pointed to a fraying spirit. Meanwhile, American morale grew. Victories fueled confidence, and the myth of German invincibility died on the lips of men who had once trembled at the thought of facing a panzer. There was also the weight of numbers. For every German tank destroyed, replacements became harder to come by. Factories lay in ruins, fuel supplies dwindled, and trained crews grew scarce. For Americans, the opposite was true. Shermans rolled off assembly lines in Detroit, radios packed into every hull, losses could be replaced. Units could be reconstituted. This knowledge strengthened morale. A citizen soldier might grieve for a fallen comrade, but he knew reinforcements would arrive, supplies would come, and the fight would continue. For Germans, every loss felt permanent, every defeat another step toward inevitable collapse. The psychological contrast deepened as the war dragged on. German propaganda, once full of contempt for the American cowboy army, now struggled to explain defeats. Some officers blamed overwhelming American industry. Others pointed to air power. Few admitted the deeper truth, that the Americans had changed the very nature of warfare by connecting their forces into a unified whole. To acknowledge this was to acknowledge that the old ways, the reliance on discipline, hierarchy, and sheer toughness, were no longer enough. And so, within the minds of German soldiers, a seed of despair took root. Battles no longer felt like contests of strength, but like struggles against an opponent who seemed to anticipate every move. Fear of encirclement, fear of invisible artillery, fear of the unseen radio net, it weighed down every advance, every counterattack. The Wehrmacht, once the predator, now felt like the hunted. For the Americans, the impact was transformative. The citizen soldier became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that ordinary men could master extraordinary challenges. The bond forged through radios extended beyond the battlefield. Soldiers wrote home about the confidence they felt in knowing help was always a call away. Veterans later recalled the comfort of voices in their ears, voices that turned loneliness into solidarity. What had begun as a technical advantage evolved into a moral one, binding men together in ways their enemies could not match. In the grand strategy of the war, this psychological shift mattered as much as any tank or plane. German armies retreated not only because they were outnumbered, but because they were outmaneuvered in spirit. The Americans, mocked as amateurs, had shown that unity, born of communication and initiative, could defeat even the most professional of foes. And once that truth settled in, the end of the German dream of dominance was only a matter of time. The citizen soldier had become more than a soldier. He had become part of a living, breathing machine, a network of courage and information that the Germans could not break. And in that transformation, the fate of the war was sealed. The fires of Lorraine dimmed, but the lesson they left behind burned far brighter than the wrecks of Shermans and Panthers rusting in the mud. By late 1944, the German army could no longer dismiss the Americans as amateurs. The citizen soldiers, mocked in propaganda, had proven themselves not only capable of fighting but capable of winning. The legacy of that revelation stretched beyond the hedgerows of France and into the very fabric of modern warfare. The Germans had long prided themselves on technical superiority. Their Panthers and Tigers were marvels of engineering, thickly armored, heavily armed, terrifying to face. Yet war is not a contest of machines alone. It is a contest of systems. And in this contest, the Americans had prevailed by binding their forces together with invisible wires of communication, turning ordinary men into an extraordinary whole. Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, reflecting after the war, admitted bitterly that German tanks may have been superior individually, but American tanks fought together. They operated as an organism, one brain directing many limbs. We built better tanks, he is reported to have said, but they built tanks that worked together. It was a concession that captured the essence of the conflict. The legacy of America's citizen soldiers lay not only in victory but in transformation. Before the war, the United States had been a nation without a professional warrior caste. Its army ranked 17th in size behind nations like Portugal, yet in the crucible of global conflict it mobilized millions, trained them, armed them, and sent them across oceans. They were not bred for war, but they learned it with startling speed, and in doing so they reshaped the perception of what a soldier could be. This legacy carried forward into the Cold War. The lessons of radio coordination evolved into doctrines of network-centric warfare. In Korea, platoons carried the same principles that had guided their fathers in France. In Vietnam, helicopters became airborne extensions of the radio net, ferrying men and firepower wherever needed. By the Gulf War of 1991, the concept had matured fully. American tanks, jets, and infantry moved as nodes in a vast digital web, guided by satellites, sensors, and computers. German officers in 1944 had witnessed the beginning of this evolution without fully understanding it. Modern armies lived it. For the veterans who survived, the memory of those days lingered in sharper detail than any manual or doctrine. A tanker from the 4th Armored Division once recalled how the crackle of the radio inside his Sherman gave him strength. We knew we weren't alone. You could hear other boys calling out, giving bearings, asking for cover. Even when you couldn't see them through the fog, you knew they were there. That kept you fighting. For the German crews, by contrast, silence was often the last sound they heard. The citizen soldier, once a figure of ridicule, became a symbol of democracy's strength. His origins, humble, civilian, ordinary, became his greatest asset. He did not fight for conquest or empire but for each other, for survival, for a world worth returning to. In that sense, the radios that bound them were more than tools of war. They were instruments of connection, reminders that even in the darkest chaos, men could remain united. The German army's psychological collapse revealed a timeless truth. Arrogance blinds, adaptability wins. By underestimating their opponents, the Germans sealed their fate. They had failed to grasp that in modern war, unity and speed outweighed firepower and armor. A Panther may have been stronger than a Sherman, but 5 Shermans moving in concert could outthink, outmaneuver, and outlast it. The battlefield rewarded those who could react fastest, not those who could hit hardest. As the war drew to its end in 1945, this truth became undeniable. From the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the ruins of the Reich itself, the citizen soldiers of America carried victory on their shoulders. They returned home, not as professional warriors, but as veterans who had proven that democracy could field an army equal to any tyrant's dream of conquest. Their legacy echoed in parades, in textbooks, and in the whispered stories told to children and grandchildren. And in military academies across the world, their story became a lesson. Connection is power. Coordination is survival. The strength of the individual matters, but the strength of the network decides wars. From radios in Sherman tanks to satellites orbiting Earth, the principle has remained constant in war. Communication is life. The Germans once sneered at America's citizen soldiers, dismissing them as weak, untrained, and unworthy of facing Europe's professional armies. But the fog of Aracourt, the fires of Lorraine, and the countless battles that followed carved another truth into history. These citizens, armed with innovation and bound by connection, not only fought, they crushed the veterans of the Reich. The legacy is clear. Superior weapons may win battles, but superior systems win wars, and the system born in the mud of France, carried by ordinary men with extraordinary resolve, still defines how armies fight today. In the end, the war did not prove that democracy was weak. It proved the opposite. The citizen soldier, mocked at the beginning, emerged as the embodiment of resilience, adaptability, and unity. From the hedgerows of Normandy to the streets of Berlin, his voice carried over radios, guiding comrades through smoke and chaos. And with that voice came a lesson for the ages: in modern war, connection outweighs firepower, and speed defeats armor.